Chapter 15. The torn horizon. The northern front was not a battle line. It was a torn horizon. I understood that before we ever reached the command ridge, before the first order was shouted in my hearing, before anyone pointed at a map and tried to pretend the black spread across the north could still be called a formation. The land itself gave the truth away. The roads north of Halcyon had become streams of iron, mud, wagon ruts, litters, spent horses, shattered carts, and men moving in one direction with faces that had stopped being surprised by how tired they were. The farther north we rode, the less the kingdom looked like a kingdom and the more it looked like a body forcing blood into a wounded limb. Supply columns moved at all hours. Temple caravans passed under double guard. Smith teams worked beside the road under canvas lean toss, hammering dents out of helms while the owners slept sitting up in the mud. Messenger relays changed horses without dismounting properly. Every stream crossing had become a choke point. Every rise had a signal mast. Every signal mast had fresh scratches where previous messages had been tied, cut, replaced, and tied again. And still the traffic north continued because stopping would have meant choosing where the body could be cut off. I rode in the fourth rank of a mixed deployment convoy attached to a forward command request stamped with more seals than trust. Dearth Voss had gone ahead with the early response strike unit 2 hours before dawn. Sacred Sever Blade 2 visibly useful for anyone in Halcyon to keep off the road once Vale Drakar's name entered official speech. Lydia Mara traveled with the artillery support column, not because anyone liked risking her, but because the Northern Line had already proved it could not afford to keep its best firepower ornamental. Owen moved separately, with fast recon and counter-incursion orders. Brent Haver and Nina Mercer rode with the heavy reserve and temple triage train. Mila Hart had been attached to the forward sensing teams where barrier and perception work mattered most. And me, I had been given a place under the broad classification the Capital preferred when it wanted use without promise. Flexible support applicability under shifting field conditions. Ugly words. Honest enough. Dorian Pike had laughed when he heard the assignment read aloud and said, "That means they need to matter somewhere and cannot yet bear the right where." He was not coming north. That had not been his decision. Or perhaps it had been, once the argument reached the point where both options offended him equally. The court wanted him where fragments, rubbings, and half of buried documents could be turned into summaries before the panic of the front disturbed thin of language altogether. He had argued for accompanying the deployment. Lydia had argued more quietly and more effectively that a dead scholar improves no archive. So he stayed with the records war in Halcyon. I carried his notes in a sealed packet inside my coat anyway, because leaving them behind had felt too much like trusting the wrong part of the world. By midday on the second day north, the sky had turned the color of old steel and the land had changed under the wheels. Less farmland, more windbent scrub, broken ridges, old bowfield mounds no one named anymore, and stretches of ground where prior fortifications had been raised, overrun, repaired, abandoned, and absorbed into the earth until only irregular stone lines remained to catch the eye. Then we climbed the last ridge before the main front and the horizon opened. It had been torn. That was the only phrase my mind offered and the only one that stayed. Not one line, not a neat clash of banners, not even several organized fronts in the old military sense. The north spread in broken depth under a sky thick with smoke, signal fire, weather, and drifting cinders from things too distant to identify and too large not to matter. Hill forts burned or smoldered in staggered positions. Defensive ditches had been broken open in some places and overfilled with dead in others. Banner clusters marked holding zones where 3 different commands had likely collided and continued from mutual necessity rather than design. Farther out, where the ridges descended into blacker country, movement never fully ceased. Columns shifted. Smoke drifted wrong. Flash lines burst and died in irregular patterns. Sometimes an entire section of the horizon seemed to bulge inward under pressure, then spit bodies, signal flares, and retreating teams back toward the kingdom's side. The front was not a line. It was damage trying to remember discipline. No one in the convoy spoke for a while after seeing it. Even the veterans did not spend words cheaply on that first view. The officer riding nearest the lead wagon finally said, "There," as if naming the wound made it easier to touch. Our assignment changed before the horses cooled. A field captain met us at the command ridge and did not bother with formal welcome. "You're all late," he said, though we weren't. That means the road still exists." He pointed down toward the lower terraces where reserve units were already being sorted by function into movement corridors that looked more like flood channels than military lanes. No one goes where they were told yesterday. The center broke and reformed left. The western low forts are still answering signals, but no one trusts the timing. If you have a specialty, keep it and learn to hate the space around it. That last line felt like something Alden Crow might have said after a week without sleep and 3 worse jokes. The command ridge itself was a raw cut of trampled earth, wagon tracks, temporary signal towers, and officer tents staked so close together that their guy lines crossed like poorly argued doctrine. Maps had been nailed to boards. Boards had been nailed to old wagon sides. Medical cots stood under open awnings because enclosed treatment took too much time to reach. Messenger chains formed and dissolved by the minute. The kingdom's beautiful central plans had reached the north and gone ugly to remain useful. I was assigned the Eastern Center Pressure Band under a line captain named Harrowvale, a woman with a broken nose that had healed crooked and a voice that sounded like command before the words got there. She took one look at my file marker, then one look at me, then looked again at the file marker as if checking whether the paper had done enough to warn me what sort of day I was entering. "You're the colder man." That was not the phrase I expected. I said, "One of them?" That was not humility. That was data. She pointed downhill toward a churn of troops reforming around 3 staggered signal poles and 1 shattered wagon barricade. "You are with the moving hold group. We don't have a stable line. We have surviving ones. Your job is to keep people breathing long enough to make the next ugly decision. No grand title, no decorative role." I almost preferred it. Then I saw the lower ground and realized preference no longer mattered. The Eastern Center Pressure Band was built around terrain no planner would have chosen willingly. A shallow basin with broken ridge fingers on the north side, churn mud flats in the middle, and old stone causeways from some prior campaign running at half-useful angles through it like the bones of a larger dead thing. The kingdom had tried to fortify the basin in stages. Stake lines, wagon walls, shield berms, mage markers. All of it had been struck, shifted, reused, abandoned, and struck again until the whole zone looked assembled by people solving 5 emergencies at once with whatever they still had in hand. It worked badly. That was still enough to matter. I found Mila first because Spirit Weave was the easiest thing to recognize amid chaos. Her threads ran pale and tight between 2 broken spear standards and the cracked axle of an overturned supply cart, making a low barrier sense web across a shallow approach lane. She was kneeling in the mud with 1 glove off and 1 pageboy assistant trying very hard not to distract her by being terrified. She looked up when I reached her. For 1 second the battlefield fell away from her face and left something like relief exposed there. Then it was gone. "You made it." "Yes, but..." She exhaled and looked back to the threads. "The lane won't stay clean." "What's wrong?" "Too much movement. Too many lines crossing. I can hold detection or harden the barrier edge, not both, and if I choose wrong the whole channel turns into a blind kill trough." That sounded exactly like the war room, only with actual blood waiting at the edge of the sentence. I crouched beside her and looked where she was looking. At first I saw only mud, broken carts, shield teams moving in partial crouches, runners sliding between them, and farther out the staggered pressure on the basin's north lip where the enemy kept testing for collapse. Then the shape resolved. The lane she had marked was the only relatively stable withdrawal path from the forward spear line if the left finger ridge failed again. If her barrier hardened too early, friendly withdrawal traffic would choke. If she kept it as pure detection, a fast incursion could gut the retreat path before anyone above understood it had happened. "Where's Owen?" I asked. Mila's mouth tightened. "Somewhere making another officer regret bad spacing." That meant not here when he was needed. Of course. I put 2 quick thread marks on the cart axle and the spear standard where her weave anchored hardest. The marks took weakly through damp wood and metal, enough to give me their line in the back of the mine. Mila glanced at me. "You can still do that in this mess." "That's useful." She did not say more because shouting rose from the basin lip and the first serious push of the day hit before we could. Abyssal pressure announced itself less by a single dramatic charge than by abrupt coherence. One moment the north lip held scattered movement hounds, corrupted infantry shapes, black-limbed things using smoke and ridge shadow. The next, 3 separate nuisance vectors aligned. Shield pressure on the center, fast cut-ins on the left hollow, 1 high dart line slipping toward the withdrawal lane behind them. Not random, patterned, and because it was patterned, people died faster if they answered late. "Now I need both," Mila said through clenched teeth. I heard Harrowvale's voice somewhere to the right, carrying above the basin and clipped command bursts. "Second file left. Don't let them fold you inward. Mercer to the low cot line. Where is..." The sentence vanished under impact. The center took the first hit. Shields crashed. Mud threw bodies sideways. A low black hound shape made it through the first spear catch and disappeared into the legs of the line. At the same time, a smaller abyssal cutter burst from the left hollow toward the withdrawal lane exactly where Mila's detection threads had thinned to preserve traffic. She chose detection. Had to. Her spirit weave flashed once pale around the incursion line and gave warning instead of resistance. Bid choice. Still not enough. The cutter would reach the withdrawal channel before the rear reserve understood the danger. I read. Not at the cutter directly. At the lane. The first 3 soldiers in the withdrawal file had already started turning the wrong way, reacting to the center pressure instead of the side incursion because men under strain follow the loudest threat first. If they turned fully, the lane would not and the cutter would butcher through spine and panic. "Keep moving." I shouted. Forward, not center. Whether they heard me or only the shape of command in the tone, I never knew. They moved. That gave me the line I needed. The cutter hit the lane edge 2 steps later. I took it on the shield, not to stop it cleanly, but to spoil its angle off the first body in the file. Force slid. My footing half broke in the mud. I let the slide carry me around instead of fighting it and used the recovery to open the retreat path wider, not narrower. Defend, and also preserve flow. The cutter turned for my knee. I cut down. The weak shove at the end of the strike nudged the thing's turn just far enough that the next spearman in the file could get his point through the seam under its jaw. The lane kept moving. That was all. No one had time to name the contribution. The basin did not care for names in those breaths. But I felt the first important truth of it there. On this scale, survival was not made of duels. It was made of preventing 1 bad second from multiplying into 10. The battle widened after that and took the rest of me with it. Large-scale combat on the northern front did not feel like a single event. It felt like being fed from one urgent partial line into the next without full permission to finish thinking about the first. There was no clean beginning after the push hit. Only acceleration. A shield knot in the center bowed and had to be re-angled before the rear rank compressed it into uselessness. A runner carrying crossbow bolts slipped in trampled mud, and I caught him by the harness strap while stepping around a hound corpse so the bolts stayed in motion instead of scattering under retreat feet. A spear team alert heated 2 episodes of after rapid brute to the line, and in those 2 I was there, shouting for the angle they couldn't seek, but how I control and from the side have my own lunch from going ragged too early. Move, and also regulate. Guard, and also redirect. Touch, and also leave the route alive. The basin kept making demands too quickly for pride. By the 4th push, I had stopped tracking where my official assignment ended and where need began. Harrow Vale saw that and, instead of stopping me, started using it. Cross, low lane. Cross, cart line, now. Cross, if you can keep that fool standing 2 breaths longer, do it. Not elegant orders. Useful ones. I did what I could. The small additions from a side, when layered across a battlefield too large for any one body to dominate, became less dramatic and more constant. My steps wasted less. My blocks bled off ugly force instead of taking it through bone. My breath did not solve fatigue, but it delayed collapse. The extra carry at the end of committed shoves kept wounded men or supply crates or half-broken line shields moving that fraction farther onto better ground before they failed. It still looked unimpressive if isolated. Nothing in the basin would have impressed the summoning hall in the way Sacred Sever Blade or Star-Crowned Sorcery did from 10 paces and polished floors. That no longer mattered. The front did not reward pretty categories. It rewarded whoever made the next 10 seconds less fatal than they wanted to be. Around midday, the scale of the thing finally sank its hooks into me properly. Up to then I had been moving from problem to problem fast enough that the mind stayed local. Shield line here. Withdrawal lane there. Spear reset. Cart choke. Runner. Left. On goal. Left. Noise. Then I reached the upper causeway to carry a message to the reserve signal team and saw the full basin from above. The center looked like a wound trying to clot and being kicked open by fresh pressure every few minutes. Nina Mercer's triage corridor ran along one rear slope under temple cloths darkened by splash and smoke. Her people moved steadily through horror with the practical tempo of those who cannot allow themselves to flinch at totals. Brent was farther west than I expected, acting as a moving anchor where a broken wagon wall and a half-collapsed berm had to serve as line center. Every time one section threatened to buckle, he threw Iron Bastion into it and gave ordinary soldiers enough confidence to remember they still had feet. Lydia stood on the high east shelf inside a ring of artillery support markers, burning controlled holes into pressure knots that would otherwise have consumed entire platoon widths. She did not cast large anymore, not unless the lane beneath her was made clear by force of command and terror combined. Her fire had learned restraint the hard way. Mila's barrier and sensing work ran through 3 separate channels now. None of them whole and all of them overused. Owen I saw only in flashes, blue-white along the basin lip, then dawn, then reappearing near a signal post just in time to save the flag line from being cut by a corrupted spear form that moved like I thought given too much steel. The battlefield was massive enough that even the summon did not stand above it. They were knots inside its larger storm. That should have been overwhelming. It was. For one full breath, the scale hit me all at once and I nearly lost the clean edge of function. So many bodies, so many lines. So many places where the wrong answer would never even know my name before it opened a lane or failed to open one. The old fear rose then in a colder form than humiliation ever had. Not of being laughed at, of being too small, of seeing too much of the battlefield's real demand and still not possessing hands large enough to answer it. Then a signal runner crashed into me from the side because he had not expected anyone to stop on the causeway in a war zone. The contact snapped the breath back into the body and the body back into work. Sorry. he shouted, already moving. I let the shove from his shoulder carry me into the turn downhill instead of wasting it. Second hand. The term came from nowhere clear, perhaps from some buried fragment in Dorian's notes, perhaps from the shape of the act itself. Use leftover motion. Do not discard force just because it arrived from the wrong source. I did not name it aloud. I used it. The runner's impact became my descent line. The descent line became a shorter entry into the low cart barrier where 3 men were trying and failing to rotate a splintered wheel wall before the next hound rush hit it broadside. I hit the barrier shoulder first in the same breath and added my own committed shove to the borrowed momentum. The wall turned, not gracefully enough. The hound rush struck at a worse angle and broke against spear points instead of into the gap. That was when something changed inside me. Not from overwhelmed to calm. That would be false. From overwhelmed to immersed. The field was still too large. I simply stopped trying to hold the whole of it in one thought. Instead, I carried one line into the next. Borrow the motion. Preserve the breath. Spoil the strike. Open the lane. Hold the body together long enough to feed the next answer into the right place. Battlefield utility at scale did not feel heroic. It felt like refusing waste until waste became angry. Hours lost clean shape after that. The sky darkened under smoke. Rain threatened and never quite arrived. The mud in the basin changed texture as blood, runoff, and trampled earth churned into something that no longer counted as ground except by legal necessity. Men began recognizing me not by name but by function. Shield there. Cross. Left. The auxiliary. The colder one. Good enough. I threaded through broken lines, half-fallen carts, signal teams, and the edge of Lydia's fire arcs with the dangerous elevated steadiness that comes when the body's systems stop arguing one at a time and start accepting ugly labor as their whole law. That was not a good state. It was an effective one. The breath layer from a side had deepened under constant motion until I no longer needed to call it consciously every time. It simply wrote the work if the work was honest. My blocks shed force more often than they failed to. The extra half step after commitment still thin, still not something I could rely on under every condition, saved me 3 times in 1 hour from cuts or hammering impacts that would have taken the joint if I had remained exactly where the enemy line expected. And more dangerously than any of that, the battlefield itself began to feel legible in a new way, not as prophecy, as density management. Look, and also analyze. The thought came in fragments at first, not a separate skill line, a side effect of not spending the whole body on survival every second. When the breath held and the footing did not betray me and the current act was properly supported, a little more mind became available to the field. A shield rank leaned before it broke. A withdrawal lane began to choke not where the bodies visibly met, but where the wounded started turning their shoulders too soon. A spear team on the left had 1 man half a heartbeat late on every reset and would collapse there before anywhere else of pressure came hard. I saw these things. I began to act on them, sometimes only by shouting a name or a direction. Sometimes by getting there first and making the next bad second slightly worse for the enemy. Sometimes by laying quick thread marks on carts, banner poles, or split stuns so I could find the stable route again through smoke and bodies without rereading the whole basin from scratch. That was the true turning point. Not that I won a duel or held a hill. That the battlefield, for moments at a time, stopped being only disaster and became a system dense enough to be influenced through small attached meanings. Dangerously elevated. There it was. Because the more the field answered, the easier it became to forget that the body paying for the answer was still one body and not a doctrine made flesh. The warning sign started subtle. A brightness at the edge of things after a fast sequence through 2 shield lines and a collapsing cart choke. A pulse thudding too sharply in the wrists while the breath still felt falsely manageable. The right hand buzzing after I used shield contact and a cut carry in quick succession to save a fallen standard bearer from being trampled in a retreat fold. I noticed. I did not stop. Not because I had forgotten Nina. Because the basin did not permit righteous pauses. That was the trap. Not private obsession in a stone chamber with no witness. Usefulness in a field where every warning could be weighed against visible bodies. Toward late afternoon, the eastern center nearly failed outright. A pressure knot formed under smoke cover on the basin's north right finger where the old causeway met broken berm. Not a grand charge. Was coordinated small penetrations through terrain everyone had started trusting because it had not yet betrayed them today. 3 hounds, 2 abyssal cutters, and 1 corrupted spear form came through staggered, each timed to the defender's responses to the last. The first hounds forced the spears high. The cutters took the knee line. The spear form hit the withdrawal angle, elegant in its filth. Harrow Vale was 50 paces away when the line bent. I was 10. The men there were not cowards. They were simply at the exact wrong stage of exhaustion to answer a layered assault cleanly. I hit the first cutter on the shield and let the force slide, opening enough room for the rear spearman to plant instead of collapsing inward. I cut the second in passing and left the shove at the end of the strike not for damage, but to turn the thing's falling body into the path of the incoming spear form. It stumbled over its own ally's collapse. I used the letter of the inch of one wound in a belly forward, preserving the he turned life to the kill. Defend, strike, reposition, preserve flow. All in one ugly sequence. No time to admire it. Barely time to know it had happened. The spear form still came. Its weapon was not a spear any longer in the human sense. Too many extra ridges, too much black corruption down the shaft. The point split into a tearing fork that wanted armor gaps and bowel openings more than clean penetration. It drove for the center chest of the nearest line soldier with horrifying single-minded perfection. I knew that shape now. Single function force taken to cruelty. I hit the shaft with my sword instead of the point, not to stop the thrust but to shave the angle, and used the rebound through my own forearm to steal one more half-step left. The thrust missed the soldier's sternum and drove through the soft underrim of his shield instead. He lived. The spear form tried to recover. My warning rose before I knew I'd seen the full line. Lo after! The rear spearman heard and dropped his back foot just in time to avoid the tearing drag that would have taken his calf to the bone. Then Harrow Vale arrived and decapitated the thing with a frontier cut that looked nothing like the capital's practice yard and everything like experience fed too long on necessity. She turned to me once, face streaked with mud and sweat. You see the follow. Yes, keep seeing it. Then she was gone again into the noise. That should have felt like praise. It felt like responsibility. By then, even I could sense the beginning of something broader and more dangerous. My actions were not only helping me survive, they were increasingly preserving others in small, ugly ways too. Not full support, nothing so grand or stable, but if I cut at a certain angle, the next lane opened for someone else. If I held a block with the right slip, a man behind me kept his footing. If I turned one line of retreat slightly before panic reached it, a whole knot of bodies kept moving instead of becoming a kill pocket. Thin ally support, not intentional enough yet to name proudly, real enough that the field kept proving it. The problem was that every small success pushed me deeper into the elevated state that made stopping feel impossible. By dusk I had forgotten to eat twice, drunk water only when Harrow Vale physically shoved his skin at my face, and was operating on the false clean strength that sometimes comes before the body opens the trapdoor. I did not feel exhausted. That was the danger. I felt sharpened, compressed, coherent. The body was lying. Mila found me near the rear signal ditch when the pressure finally eased enough for men to notice their own hands again. Her threads had gone almost colorless with strain. There you are, she said. I'm here. She looked me over once and the expression in her face tightened in a way I had already learned to distrust. That's not what I meant. I wiped mud from the edge of the shield with my thumb and only then realized my hand was shaking more than it should have been. Did the lane hold? Yes, she said. Because you kept dragging wounded men into the right path before they knew it themselves. She paused. That shouldn't worry me as much as it does. The honesty of that landed quietly. I wanted to answer with something sensible. Instead I said, I know. She held my gaze. No, I don't think you do. Then a horn blew from the upper ridge and she was gone again, called by her own function before the conversation could get more useful. The basin's pressure did not fully break until night. Even then it did not become peace. Only the slower violence of darkness, torches, groaning carts, shouted counts, and the endless labor of resetting a line that would have to hold again by dawn. We were pulled back from the eastern center in increments rather than relief. One knot at a time. One cart. One surviving spear file. One medical corridor. One signal team. I found metal with operated after the full dark, shield under the shoulder and the Pecatarians. Notice listen how it drained the battlefield with an old string. The north burned in broken places, not enough to light the whole front, enough to show distance in flashes and make the gaps look like mouths. Harrow Vale reported to a ridge captain with the tone of someone too tired for ceremony and too alive to waste energy on collapse. I stood 20 paces back because that was where my function ended in official accounting and began again only when the next urgent thing needed an unnamed edge. That was where Alden found me. I didn't see him first. I heard one boot stop beside mine on the ridge gravel, turned, and for one absurd heartbeat my mind refused the sight because it had filed him under Calder, infirmary, not yet fit for northern field return. But there he was. Sir Alden Crow under a heavy frontier cloak, still leaner than he had been before the wound and moving with the careful efficiency of a man whose body had not forgiven him for surviving. The right side under the ribs was bound under the coat, and his posture gave away more than he likely knew. He should not have been there. Tara would have agreed valiantly. His face looked harder in the ridge torchlight, more cut by fatigue, less patient with distances. He looked at the basin below first, then at me, then back to the basin. You look worse, I said. That's because I came from a fort and not a palace mirror. I almost smiled. Almost. Then he looked at my right hand hanging near the shield strap, and the smile died unborn, because the hand was still trembling, not grossly enough. Alden saw that. He saw this up in my voice too. The two people were breathing. The false did this after full this rain. The way my bird kept flipping over the base of one. Even I stood still with some part of me now accepted saying and still realized it. And for the first time since I met him, I saw something in his face I had never wanted from him. Not disappointment. Not exactly fear either. Unsettlement. He looked at me as if the field below had changed one more thing while he was gone, and this time he was not certain he liked the shape of it. You've gone farther, he said. Not a question. The north burned below us in torn strips of light and smoke. I looked out at the basin because looking at him felt harder in that instant. Yes, I said. Alden was quiet for a long breath. Then he said, very carefully, that is not the same as saying it was time. Chapter 16. One meaning veil appeared and erased a defensive line with a single absolute action. It happened just before dawn, when the northern front had reached that false gray hour where everything looks half forgiven by distance and half condemned by the shapes that survive it. The eastern center had held through the night badly enough to count. Men slept in slices against wheel rims and berms. Others never slept at all. The ground still carried yesterday's blood and the seams where runoff had failed to thin it. The signal masts above the basin clicked and answered one another in the wind while the sky slowly unsealed from black into iron. I was on the upper ridge because Harrowvale had refused to let me drop straight into another shift after the previous day's work. You can stand and observe, she said. If you insist on being useful, do it with your eyes before your body starts lying more elegantly. That had not been mercy. It had been command. Alden Crow, standing beside me under his cloak with the wound under his ribs still dictating what kind of anger he was allowed to spend, had approved with a silence that did more damage than words. So I stood on the ridge and watched the torn horizon breathe. The northern line never truly slept. Even in lull, the dark moved wrong beyond the ridges. A few pockets of fighting still flickered in the western low ground. A wagon train limped south under torch cover. Runners crossed the rear slope. Priests and healers moved among cots and ditch shelters with the quiet, practiced speed of people who had stopped expecting thanks from the living and stopped needing it from the dead. No one on the ridge was relaxed. That, more than anything, made the first sign matter. It wasn't a horn. It wasn't a charge. It wasn't even visible at first. The noise went away. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic cut. One section of the western ridge lay too far to see clearly without lens work, but close enough that we had been reading its signal behavior through the morning simply stopped sounding like a battle. The usual texture vanished. No shield impacts. No shouted corrections. No staggered horn replies. No panic collapse noise either. Just absence. Harrowvale saw it at the same time I did. Her posture changed by a fraction, shoulders drawing tighter under fatigue and mail. Lens, she said. One of the signal sergeants handed her a tube. She looked west, went still, then passed it not to me but to Alden. He took it one-handed and lifted it carefully because the right side still punished him for speed. I watched his face as he looked. That was enough. Alden lowered the tube more slowly than usual. What? Harrow asked. He gave her the lens instead of answering. That was when the western horn finally sounded. Once, not warning, not alarm in the ordinary sequence. A broken note, too long, too flat. A horn blown by a man whose mouth had not yet accepted what his eyes had seen. Harrow looked through the lens. Then she swore. No elaboration, no officer's discipline over language. Just one clean frontier oath that made every nearby soldier on the ridge stop pretending their attention was anywhere else. Signal all eastern commands, she snapped. Unknown field commander confirmed. Repeat confirmed. Reserve brace, no one advances blind. Itmarrow's battery line awake now. Runners moved before the order finished. I took the lens from the sergeant because no one told me not to and looked west. At first the distance made nonsense of detail. Smoke strips ridge berms black movement across pale dead grass. Then the field resolved around a center shape, not because it was large, but because everything near it had ceased to behave like ordinary battle. The line there had not broken. It had been cut out. Imagine a defensive rank under pressure. Shields brace. Spears set. Mages or archers or whatever support still breathing behind them. Then remove them, not the shape of the figuration, but the fact that the rhythm of one point is had handled the set it in the barrier. That was what I saw. Bodies were still there, some standing, some not. But the defense they made together had been deleted so completely that the gap read cleaner than collapse ever does. Too straight, too immediate, too final. And in the middle of the gap stood a figure dark enough that the dawn had not yet decided whether it wanted to reveal him. Vale Drakkar. I did not know it was him from any heraldry or face. I knew because the gap around him looked deliberate. He stood on the broken lip of the western ridge line among fallen stakes and half-split shields. Tall, though distance may have exaggerated by myth and fear. cloaked in something that moved less like cloth than like darkness trained to remain attached. One arm carried a long weapon, not a sword exactly, not a spear either, something between line and execution. The other hung free at his side as if it had no need to help. Around him, abyssal pressure did not swarm, it aligned. Single-purpose creatures, hounds, cutters, spear forms, all the lesser horrors that usually arrived in jagged nuisance waves, moved with a new relation to one another. Not orderly in the human sense, not disciplined by banner and drill, more like filings around a magnet. The western line tried to close the gap. That was the second thing I saw clearly enough to feel in my own ribs. A shield knot folded inward from the left, another from the right. Ordinary competent reflex under catastrophe, closed the wound before it becomes a door. Veil moved, the distance and smoke stole exact mechanics, but not the result. One step, one draw of the weapon through air, no flourish, no visible strain, and the two folding shield knots ceased being answers, not exploded, not scattered the way Gareth's sacred sever might have sent men flying if it hit full, not burned away like Lydia's fire could burn bodies from the shape of their own certainty. They were overwritten. The best way I can describe it is this: whatever those soldiers intended their movements to mean, brace, seal, hold, recover, his action fixed the encounter to one meaning only, and that meaning was opening. The shields split along lines that ignored their angles. The men behind them folded backward as if their stance logic had been revoked. The gap widened cleanly. The horn on the ridge beside us sounded then, full alarm now. Runners broke in all directions. Lydia's battery line, farther east, began flashing signal lamps before her fire geometry had fully woken. Harrow Vale rounded on the ridge command posts. Confirm asset positions. A clerk shouted back answers over the noise. Voss already moving from the center shelf. Marrow battery ready in one. Red off south recon loop, returning. Bastion reserve 3 minutes out. Mercer on triage ridge. Heart-shifting barrier team. All of it sounded like a list being fed into a mouth too large. Alden took the lens back from me. You see it, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, what? How to answer that? Not the man's face. Not the exact cut line. Not the title. So I gave him the only truth I had. He makes other actions mean what he wants. Alden's jaw hardened. That yes frightened me more than if he had argued. Because it meant he saw it too. Below us, the front began redistributing around the western rupture. Orders rippled eastward. Reserve flags lifted. A mage flare signaled emergency support arc. Harrow grabbed my shoulder before I had fully realized I'd stepped toward the ridge path. You do not go west alone. I was in, you are. Fair. She released the shoulder only to point downhill. You're with the moving support redeploy. We hold the eastern basin until command decides whether the west can be stitched or amputated. If that thing comes our direction, you watch the line and shout before men die of stupidity. No one objected to that use of me now. Not after yesterday. Not after Calder. That should have felt good. It didn't. It felt like being given a lamp in a storm after being told the storm had learned a name. We redeployed at a run. The front after dawn was worse because daylight removed all the excuses darkness gives to imagination. You could see the western rupture now without a lens whenever the smoke shifted an ugly straight wound through layered defenses where the line should have held longer. You could also see the attempt to contain it. Gareth strike unit cutting across from center. Lydia's fire columns relocating in controlled intervals. Owen's fast teams peeling off the southern recon arc and vanishing toward the west flank. Brent's reserve wall moving like a dragged fortress. Mila's barrier crews uprooting and reforming under shouted command. Nina's triage lanes already waiting for what the west would spit back if it still could. The whole front was turning to face one person. That alone told me enough about how bad things had become. By the time I reached the western middle shelf with Harrow's redeploy knot, Gareth was already in. I saw him from the side, White Force screaming a long sacred sever blade in a line so bright it made the dawn look ashamed of its own light. He had chosen exactly the answer a front like this should choose against an impossible rupture. Strike the spear point. Break the commander. Reverse the momentum by force of superior will before the line learns it has permission to die. On almost any field, against almost any enemy, that would have been the right answer. Vale took the first blow on his weapon and the second on nothing I could name. Sacred Sever hit with enough force to carve stone as stone had been in the way. The first impact lit the entire broken ridge. The second should have followed through the line Gareth always builds when he commits fully cut, continue, consume the space beyond. It didn't. Vale met the first line not by overpowering it with greater visible force, but by making the exchange belong only to Severance on his own terms. Gareth's blade still blazed. The strike still carried all its holy violence, but the continuation died, not blocked. The follow-through that made Gareth, his ability to make one righteous forward act devour the next breath of battle simply failed to exist past the point Vale accepted. Sacred sever cut, and the cut became only the first cut. Nothing beyond it lived. Gareth saw it a fraction later than I did from the side. That fraction cost him. Vale's return was one straight black line through the opening where Gareth's second meaning should have been. Gareth twisted with astonishing speed for a man in full commitment and still took the hit across the chest guard hard enough to launch him backward over Broken Ridge stakes. White light burst from the impact. His armor held. His stance did not. He landed, rose at once, and came again. Pride, courage, will, all the things that make hero candidates useful and dangerous to themselves. The second clash lasted longer and taught less. Vale's weapon met his blade, displaced the holy line by less than a handspan, and the whole exchange bent around that small correction as if it had been inevitable from the beginning. Gareth's center opened. Vale's free hand struck once into the sternum plate. Not flashy, not grand, just absolute. Gareth went down to one knee. Not defeated, not dead, overwritten. The Western Ridge gasped around it. Told him. Someone shouted. No one close enough survived the next 3 steps to do it. That was fear at its worst, not my own. The fronts. Because everyone watching the West saw what had happened to the obvious answer when it met Vale head-on. Lydia answered next because she had to. Her artillery shelf had only just finished reforming, and already she stood in the center of a restrained kill geometry so complex that the assistants around her looked like lesser moons trapped in a cruel orbit. She did not cast broad this time. She knew better now. After Valadrift, after the old channels, after the repeated proof that large direct magnificence feeds some enemies exactly what they want. She cast layered fire instead. 3 converging lances, 1 high to force posture, 1 low to punish the step, 1 delayed central strike to land where the first 2 corralled the answer. Beautiful, intelligent, deadly. Vale looked up. That was all. He did not try to outrun the fire. He did not negate it with some dramatic abyssal blast. He chose one of the 3 lines as primary reality and let the others die of irrelevance around it. The high lance bent off his weapon's path and carved empty air. The low lance struck where his foot had been because the step it punished was not the step he actually meant. The delayed central strike truly hit and black fire peeled from his cloak in a ragged flare that made the watching soldiers shout with raw desperate hope. Then the hope died with professional speed. The hit had landed on the only meaning Lydia's sequence could still preserve once the first 2 were denied. A direct central strike. Powerful, accurate, alone. Vale took it, burned, and continued. He lifted the weapon once, black line against crimson dawn, and Lydia's entire casting shelf broke apart. Not the people only, the geometry, the carefully prepared intervals, the relation between caster, support, and target. 1 strike across the distance, too far to make sense in muscle logic, and the stone lip where her primary anchors stood open in a clean tearing trench. Lydia herself avoided death by the width of a page because Mila's spirit weave, stretched to madness from 3 positions away, flashed across the shelf and bent her final step out of the cut line. Lydia hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up with blood at the temple and fury in both eyes. Still alive. Still not enough. Owen tried next from the flank because Owen exists to find the line direct strength and direct fire leave exposed. He did not attack once. He attacked 6 times in one approach, each strike a test, each movement refusing to become the primary line until too late to answer. I would have bet on him if betting had still belonged to the front. Vale didn't chase the speed. He didn't have to. He chose the one moment Owen's body must mean arrival, and killed that meaning. The first 3 entries missed by design. The 4th should have been real, or at least real enough to make the defense commit. Vale ignored it. The 5th came from Owen's blind side line, speed folded through Broken Ridge rock and smoke. Vale wasn't there. No, worse than that. He was exactly there in the only way that mattered. He had fixed the encounter to the arrival point, not the feints or the motion debt leading into it. When Owen's body finally had to become one true thing long enough to land harm, Vale's weapon was already waiting in that future. Owen twisted out with impossible reflex and still lost blood from shoulder to hip in one black tearing line that should have cut him into separate stories. He lived because the strike had not taken full purchase through rotating speed. He also went down hard enough that the flank unit around him broke formation trying to save him. Brent hit the field after that and did what only Brent could do. He made himself a wall in a place where walls were dying. Iron Bastion burned bronze over him and a reserve knot behind him. Not as a full field technique, he didn't possess one, but as a brutal local reality. Plant, brace, refuse deletion, force the enemy commander to spend himself on density. For one breath, it worked. Vale's first strike met Brent's held line, and the line stayed. Men on the western shelf actually shouted. Then Vale changed nothing visible and everything essential. He struck again, same place, same terrible economy, but the second line rode not the shield or the armor. It rode the meaning of the brace itself. Brent's hole became only held. No spread, no rooted support into the men behind him. no secondary value. The wall reduced to one body doing one thing, and then, because one body cannot be a wall for long against that much singular force, the body failed. Brent did not fall backward. He went straight down, one knee slamming the dirt, arms still up because Iron Bastion is obscene even in defeat. The reserve not behind him lived only because Nina's supported corridor had already reached them and temple bearers dragged the nearest wounded clear before the gap widened into harvest. That was when fear became comprehension, not complete comprehension, only enough to hurt. Vale was not merely strong. He was not merely fast. He was not some generic abyssal tyrant whose power scaled larger than ours. He was perfected one-function force. Everything about him, from the way the front ruptured around his presence to the way every specialist answer became less than itself in contact, pointed to the same truth. He made actions singular, not simple, singular. One strike only a strike. One defense only a defense. One cast only a cast. One speed entry only an arrival. One wall only a body standing in one place. And then he broke that one thing with absolute efficiency. I felt the realization go through me like a hidden blade. Because my whole ugly path had been the opposite. A weak skill made useful by refusing to let an action mean only one thing. A block that also opened. A step that also preserved breath. A strike that also shoved, marked, destabilized, or carried. Emotion that did not spend itself cleanly into one proud result. Vale fixed meaning. I distorted it. The thought arrived complete enough that for one dangerous heartbeat I stopped hearing the front. Then a horn blast from Harrow Vale's section dragged me back into the body. The western shelf had not held, but neither had it fully collapsed. Surviving officers were doing the ugly work of turning awe and terror back into local command. Gareth was on his feet again, barely. Lydia had reformed 2/3 of a cast in line. Owen was being hauled to one side by his own speed team, fighting them the whole way because wounded predators hate assistance. Brent still knelt, not dead, which felt like a political statement against physics. Mila's barriers now linked broken ground more than people, preserving routes through the failing shelf. Nina's triage corridor had already advanced forward under fire because battlefield medicine is a species of contempt for timing. And Vale continued forward, not rushing, not exulting, not pausing to admire what he had done to the kingdom's finest pieces. He simply advanced toward the next line as if battle were only the most efficient route through necessary work. That calm was worse than any roar. Harrow Vale found me by the shoulder and spun me toward the lower flank. You are not staring at him for free. I know, but then move where the line still listens. I went because she was right and because I had no business in the western hero kill zone yet. Not to save Gareth with a shield, not to solve Lydia's fire, not to challenge Vale directly and become one more teaching moment in a front that had already learned too much. But I watched him as I moved. That was the part ruled by fury, not a scream, not blind charge. The cold fury that comes when comprehension arrives with an insult inside it. He had done to Gareth, Lydia, Owen, and Brent in minutes what the ritual hall once threatened to do to me: socially reduce worth to one obvious legible function and then judge it by whether it held under contact. And he was better at it than the court. The eastern lower line took fresh pressure while the western shelf reeled. Abyssal hounds and spear forms tried to widen the opening Vale had made by forcing the kingdom's attention toward him. Harrow's command not stretched then. Mila's barrier on our side began fraying where too many retreating bodies and too many incoming vectors demanded two contradictory things from the same space. This was work I knew. Ugly, immediate, survival scale work. I blocked for a spearman and opened the lane behind him instead of holding my own place. I shoved a wounded bearer across a stable plank where the mud would otherwise have eaten the first step. I used breath carry to run one extra relay between Nina's new forward cut line and Harrow's reserve angle without drowning in my pulse entirely. I laid 2 thread marks on a broken wagon axle and a ridge stone so Mila could hook her weave through the road I knew would survive the next crush. Small acts, still small. The battlefield did not become mine because I understood Vale's principle. It simply stopped being fully alien. Then the western rupture turned toward us. I did not see Vale move across the entire front. No one did. One moment he was still on the broken shelf where Gareth's strike unit had failed to halt him. The next, the pressure vector that should have continued west instead curved inward like a blade being redrawn toward the center. Officers shouted updated bearings. Signal flags corrected. Someone on the ridge screamed the new line twice before the sound made sense. He's cutting central. That was how commanders speak when the impossible starts choosing terrain. The front around me changed flavor at once. Not broader fear now. Localized terror. The kind that arrives when men realize the thing killing named champions might enter their ditch next. Harrow Vale didn't let it become language. Short brace. Do not overcommit. Cross watch the second line. The second line. Yes, that was all I had. The first ranks met the redirected pressure badly because redirected pressure always feels unfair on arrival. Shields came up too high, expecting hounds or ordinary spear forms. The first abyssal cutter went under and opened a knee. The second hit the widened stance. Men died because the body had chosen the wrong first answer for a different enemy. I was there before thought caught up. Block low. Spill force. Shout the next angle. Move the wounded where the following body won't trip over him and die second. The line held 3 breaths longer than it should have. Then Vale entered it. No herald. No dramatic corridor of dead before him this time. Only the front center suddenly resolving around one absence of air so severe that everything near it looked sloppy by contrast. He came through smoke and bodies like a law. Up close, he was not giant. That shocked me first. Tall, yes. Broad in the shoulders. Armor dark as quenched iron with no unnecessary ornament. Every pale line flowing toward the long black weapon in his hand as if the body had been built to serve the motion it enabled. No ground. No abyssal pageantry. The helm was open enough to show a face, and that was somehow worse. Human structure worn thin by something colder. No rage in it. No visible delight. Eyes black enough that the whites had become rumor. Vale Drakkar looked less like a monster than like the most merciless conclusion a man-shaped weapon could reach. He struck the front rank. Nummy. 3 bodies left of me. The first soldier brace. The second leaned to reinforce. The third raised a spear to catch the opening if the first 2 held. I saw the structure. I saw why it should work against almost anything else. I saw why it died. Vale's weapon entered the line and made the first man's defense mean only contact. The reinforcement from the second ceased to be reinforcement because the first act no longer carried outward. The spear from the third arrived into a space where support had already been simplified away. 1 strike. 3 failures. No waste. The line ceased to be a line. I don't think I chose to move. I think the whole path up to that point moved in me. My shield met the return cut not where the current line demanded, but where the next line had to emerge if I stayed legible. I let the force slide, took the extra thin half step after the committed defense, and in the same instant shoved the dying spearman's body aside with my off hip so the collapse under him didn't drag the next man down too. Defend, slip, preserve the lane. Vale's weapon passed through the space I would have occupied if the block had meant only block. For one impossible heartbeat, I was still alive inside his range. His eyes found me. Not surprise. Recognition too cold for that. The weapon turned. I understood then what Gareth, Leah, Owen, and Brent had felt from 4 different angles. Not defeat. Fixation. The sensation that the encounter itself was trying to become singular around you. One obvious body. One obvious defense. One obvious death. Panic clawed up from the spine. Discipline met it halfway. Neither fully won. I did not try to beat his line. I tried to refuse its loneliness. My shield took the first contact glancing. The slip carried into the retreat. The retreat stole the second half step. My sword touched his weapon shaft not as challenge, but as interference. Touch and also leave, the mark took. Not the deep thread hold I had achieved on the Labyrinth Guardian's exposed seam. Not even close. Vale's presence was too coherent, too singularly organized for my crude mark to settle deeply. Still, for the smallest, cruelest instant, I felt him. Not his thoughts. Not weakness. Only the terrible unity of his motion. One line through everything. One purpose carried so perfectly that all other nearby meanings were forced to simplify or break. The contact nearly stripped the grip from my hand. The recoil up the arm felt like striking not metal, but a verdict. I survived because I did not stay where survival should have meant standing. His second strike came for the position my first escape logically preserved. I wasn't there. The carry from my retreat had already fed the next off angle. His weapon tore through my cloak edge and nothing more. Hero Vale shouted something. Maybe my name. Maybe an order. I never knew. The front of dying. Vale corrected toward the true center of the line again. A reserve corporal charged him from the right in exactly the kind of brave, complete act the front usually rewards with songs later if the singer survives. Vale killed him without looking, not contemptuously, efficiently. The corporal's strike became only overextension. The answer wrote itself. Fury rose then, clean and almost bright. Not because I imagined I could kill him, because I had felt enough to know what I hated. He made the world mean less. That was what his perfection was auction. A front of complex human survival turned into one open lane. A cast turned into only a cast. A wall turned into only a kneeling man. A charge turned into only overextension. A defense turned into only contact before breaking. I hit his blind side with my shield not to wound, not to stagger, but to make the local exchange contain more than his chosen line. The impact barely moved him. The added shove at the end did worse than barely. It made him notice me again. That was almost fatal. He turned fully this time. No distractions. No field-wide pressure context. No other hero occupying the front of his attention. Just me and the consequence of refusing the singular line twice. I have thought often since then about those next few breaths, not because they were glorious, because they were exact, pure, body deep, not negotiable. Then comprehension sharpening through it. I could not oppose him by being better at any single thing he had already fixed. I could only survive by overloading the local meaning of my own actions enough that his first read failed to finish me. The next exchange proved it. He struck high. That should have been high only. It wasn't. The cut carried pressure to my lower retreat line as well. I could feel it in the way his shoulder and hips arranged. One function so perfected it had no visible branching and still contained total follow-through. I blocked high, slipped the force. At the same time, I let the step back preserve breath and angle, not full retreat. The high line survived. The lower follow-through missed the true leg line because my body had not become only a high block. For one tiny hateful instant, I was not entirely overwritten. I understood the route and hated the size of it. Then he kicked my shield. No grandeur, boot timing, body weight. The contact should have been simple. It wasn't. The kick hit exactly where the prior slip had forced me to rely on structure rather than full brace. My arm nearly failed. I gave up the upright line deliberately, dropping lower, choosing the useful lost the way Alden had taught on gnats and bad stone. Vale's weapon passed where my throat had been. I hit the dirt on one knee, mud and blood soaking the side of my coat, and came up under the line because the fall had not ended the movement wastefully. Carry through. That tiny ugly truth saved me from his third strike, and no one around us knew why. Mila did. I heard her voice from somewhere behind the line, ragged with strain. He's bending out of it. That was the closest anyone had come yet to naming what I was doing from the outside. Vale heard her too. His head turned a fraction toward her sound. That fraction was all Harrow Vale needed. She slammed a reserve pike through the local lane, not at Vale himself, but across the ditch edge where his next planted step would have wanted unbroken ground. Not enough to wound. Enough to break the perfect simple path for one heartbeat. I used that heartbeat to get out. Not heroically. Desperately, efficiently, half falling and half carrying myself through the gap left by the dead corporal and the split line. Vale did not chase me. That hurt more than if he had, because it meant I had survived contact without yet rising to true priority. He had measured me, found something inconvenient, and returned to the larger work of deleting the front. I staggered back into Harrow's knot with my pulse trying to break out through my teeth. The right hand shook violently now. My breath came too orderly for the amount of terror spent. That was bad. I knew it even then. Useful. Dangerous. Same old pair. Harrow grabbed my shoulder hard enough to bruise later. What did you see? I looked at Vale. At the front collapsing around the point his weapon touched. At the men who still answered him as if singular excellence could solve singular excellence. He fixes the first meaning, I said. Harrow blinked once. What? He makes the act only one thing. You could not fit that cleanly into a field brief. It was the truest one I had. She saw immediately that translation into command language would take too long. So she asked the better question. How do we live? I swallowed once. The answer tasted like defeat and necessity. Don't finish cleanly. Harrow stared. Then, to my everlasting respect, she did not ask for a philosophy lesson. She turned and screamed at the lying. Do not spend the whole action. Keep the second step. Shields angle and recover, don't lock. Half the men would not understand her. Some did. Enough to matter for the next 30 breaths. The line against Vale did not hold. Let me be honest there. It bent, tore, reformed in tatters, and bought time rather than safety. But those few breaths changed texture. A shieldman who would have braced fully left a fraction of his weight in recovery and lived through the back cut that killed the man beside him. A spearman on the right checked his thrust halfway short and turned the weapon into a spoil instead of a full commit, opening an escape lane rather than feeding Vale one clean overextension. Mila's barrier thread stopped trying to block him outright and instead preserved 3 retreat intervals behind the local collapse. Nina's corridor bearers, hearing Harrow's shouted nonsense and not knowing why, kept moving instead of planting flat under pressure. The front still bled. It bled less stupidly. That was all I had bought. That and the fury of knowing how far from enough it remained. Then the reserve horns changed. 3 notes. Withdrawal code for local section, not full route. The western middle shelf had become untenable. Command was not yet calling route, but it was cutting away the meat before Vale bit through the bone. We were to fall back to the second ridge line, preserve living strength, and yield ground. Vale knew it before the horns finished. He accelerated, not in speed alone, in purpose. The whole local field around him simplified. Hounds stopped ranging. Spearforms stopped harrying side lanes and began driving bodies inward toward his line. The pressure ceased pretending to be a broad front and became one thrust without auxiliaries. Perfected single-function force. There it was again, the enemy shape taking after its commander. Retreat under that kind of pressure is not movement. It is surgery performed by frightened people with dirt in their hands. Harrow Vale became all voice and no wasted self. Second rage, carry your own wounded if they can breathe. Leave carts. Leave the damned carts. I took one bear under the shoulder, a kid no older than I had been when effort first started feeling like the only honest religion. His thigh was open and his eyes had gone too clear. We moved. Step and regulate. Wait under him and also under me. Use his stagger as my line. Borrow the motion. Do not let the field take one act and freeze it there. Vale cut through the front behind us. I heard it more than saw it now. Not the weapon itself. The way bodies and lines answered. The clean wrongness of a defense becoming only failure in his presence. Retreating men break for many reasons. Panic, pain, loss of command, loss of friends, loss of faith in the line. What Vale induced was more poisonous. He made them stop trusting complexity. Under him, every man wanted one clear answer. One, Bryce, Strite, Fay, anything singular enough to hold on to. I understood then with a fury almost holy in its coldness why my path had to become what it was becoming. Because singular answers are merciful to frightened minds. And mercy like that gets you killed by things built to own the one meaning. The second ridge line caught us like a half-closed hand. Brent, back on his feet and angrier than physics approved, anchored the left berm with iron bastion while reserve squads rebuilt the center under him. Lydia's fire line moved twice and then finally found an elevation that let her burn the following pressure without feeding Vale a direct magical corridor. Fury reason, and still had the left to sit the kingdom instead of himself. Gareth returned too. He was pale under the grime, chest guard cracked, one arm not moving right. He went for Vale again. Of course he did. No one stopped him. Not because it was wise. Because some things are too central to a man's shape to forbid in the middle of a front. He struck from the second ridge this time with less grand commitment and more murder in him, sacred sever blade burning not as a banner, but as a vow sharpened to white. For one breath, I thought he had learned enough from the first clash to matter differently. He had, just not enough. Vale accepted the new line, measured the reduced overcommitment, and answered the same truth from a different angle. Gareth's first cut remained cleaner this time, less of a gift. Vale did not overwrite the continuation by direct contact. He stepped inside the preserved second line and forced Gareth to spend it early. The holy blade still severed. The severance still mattered, but the second meaning Gareth had fought to preserve was consumed before it reached the shape he wanted. Vale's answer broke his shoulder and sent him tumbling down the berm. Not fail. Another lesson bought in meat. Lydia saw it happen and her face changed in a way I had not seen on her before. Not panic. Fury stripped of all court polish. She cast without waiting for lame perfection. Not broad. Not reckless. Just earlier than she preferred, trusting the rough ridge line more than ideal sequence because Gareth was down and Vale had to stop moving for 1 second. The fire hit broken ground around him and turned the ridge face into a trench of molten slag, smoke, and red-gold glare. Men shouted. The pressure around Vale staggered. Hounds burn. Spear forms broke formation. Vale walked through it, not untouched. That matters. His cloak burned away in strips. One side of the dark armor beneath took red fracture lines from shoulder to hip. His face showed through the smoke then, pale and cut by shadow, beautiful in the way avalanches are if you decided not to survive them. He looked directly toward Lydia's ridge, and for the first time, I saw effort. Smell. Real. The line around his mouth tightened. The next strike he made toward her shelf was not effortless elegance. That mattered too. It still split the forward lip of her position and killed 2 battery men before they could duck. It also failed to reach her. Mila's barrier had bent the line by a fraction. Owen's last disruption had forced the angle less pure. Lydia's earlier cast point had not been where his first perfect answer wanted it. Thin distortions. To Vale. Still not enough to beat him. Enough that his perfection had to work. I saw that and knew how this part of the fight would end before the front had fully paid for it. Vale was not invincible. He was simply too singularly complete for our current answers. And mine alone was not immediately deleted because mine refused completion in the shape he preferred. That was the rout, not victory. Raved by full morning command finally did what pride hates most and ordered broad withdrawal from the western middle shelf entirely. Not panic retreat. Structured retreat under sacrificial hold groups and collapsing artillery arcs. Men cursed the order. Men obeyed it. Men died buying the difference. Harrow Vale's knot was one of the sacrificial holds. She looked at me when the assignment came and saw too much in one glance. Fatigue. Shut up. Fui. The dangerous steadiness still trying to pose as function. You can still move, she said. Yes. Can you still choose? That was the better question. I forced my hand still around the shield grip and answered yes. Then you carry messages and bodies, not pride. We held for 20 more minutes. Long enough for Brent to drag 2 whole files back through the berm gap. long enough for Nina's rear corridor to clear the worst wounded, long enough for Mila's last barrier threats to turn 3 blind kills into ugly escapes, long enough for Owen to vanish into smoke and come back with his standard no one had asked him to say because even fast men need symbols sometimes. Long enough for Lydia to burn the ridge behind us black so the enemy had to climb ruin instead of intact earth. Long enough for me to see Vale once more through smoke and churned retreat lanes. He stood on the broken western shelf looking not like triumph but like continuation, a general not of glory, of function, the front around him narrowed by nature. He turned his head toward the second ridge where I was helping drag a wounded signal sergeant over a shattered cart tongue, and though the distance made certainty impossible, I had the absolute conviction that he recognized me as the one body on the field that had twice failed to become only one thing in his reach. The conviction chilled me and fed me at the same time. We made the second line, not held. There is a difference. By noon the western middle shelf was gone. By noon Gareth's shoulder was bound and he was trying to rise anyway. By noon Lydia's hands shook visibly when she thought no one who mattered watched. By noon Brent had regained enough wind to insult his surgeon and thereby reassure the whole reserve. By noon Owen had blood in one boot and murder in both eyes. By noon Mila's face had gone white with overuse. By noon Nina had so much blood on her sleeves that temple pages avoided looking directly at her unless instructed. By noon Oldebo found me and in under a splintered signal frame while I was trying to write 3 little lines of thought. He forgot the order of Vale's motion and of the legend. He took the note page from my hand, read the first half line, and gave it back. I had written, he kills the second meaning first. Alden's eyes lifted to mine. That's no. Yes, you sound angry. Yes, but he looked west where the smoke still carried black over the ruined shelf. Then back at me. Can you fight him? Not now, not ever, not alone, not with any honesty except one. No. Alden nodded once. Can you see a route? That answer hurt more because it was partly yes. Yes, I said, but not enough. He watched me a long time then, in that way of his that always felt like inspection stripped of insult and praise alike. You're the first man I've met on this front who said both in the same breath. That's not comfort. No, Alden said, it's not. The basin below us had become another line, another damage pattern, another place the kingdom would try to turn into Dakin by evening and memory by night season. Men moved, orders passed, stretchers went, smoke rose. The war continued with all the disrespect for understanding that war usually carries. I stood under the signal frame with the note page in one hand and Vale's shape still cutting through the back of my mind. Fear had come first, then comprehension. Now fury had cooled into something much harder, obsession, not with beating him tomorrow, not with proving myself to rooms that still loved classification more than truth. With the route itself, Vale fixed meaning and broke it. I bent meaning and survived. That gap between us was the whole war in miniature. And as I looked west over the line he had erased and the ridge we had only just managed not to lose entirely, I knew with a certainty too cold to mistake or hope that surviving contact twice had not brought me close. It had only shown me where the next growth had to begin.